On behalf of the Department of Sociology, I'm really pleased to welcome Michael Burawoy back to Madison. Michael has been a guest on several occasions. He is a remarkable scholar who's been a leader in the field of sociology for going on 5 decades now. He really has done it all. He's contributed substantially to Marxist theory, to methodology through ethnography and the extended case method, to substantive projects on labor, migration, and social stratification, just to name a few. He also had a huge hand in reshaping and reinvigorating press for public sociology. This was something that Herbert Gons explored in his 1988 presidential address for ASA, and Michael extended and reimagined this in his 2004 ASA presidential address. He's been a friend to the department for some time. He's the academic advisor of 2 colleagues that may or may not be in the room, and is a close friend, was a close friend and collaborator to Eric Holdenwright, who we all remember, a scholar of incredible stature and somebody who really helped build this department up, and for whom, of course, the Havens Rights Center is in part named. So it's a pleasure to have Michael here with us this week, and a pleasure to have Michael take us along with him on yet another chapter in this extraordinary intellectual journey. In this chapter, or I guess 4 sub-chapters, he will explore the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. So please join me in welcoming Michael Burawoy.
Thank you for the invitation to come here. It's always an honor to be here in Madison. We particularly like to thank Adrian and Jana Ina.
Good.
Okay. Yeah. So you've been terrific in making this a very pleasant event for me so far, anyhow. Yes, I've never been so well looked after before and at my rival here. I'd also like to mention Marcia Wright, who I thought I saw there, yes, who very kindly agreed to put me up in her home. And we have long conversations about many sorts of things late into the night. So thank you, Marcia. And Gay Seidman also looks after me when I come to Madison. So thanks to Gay. And thank you, Eric, wherever you, well, you just, there you are, for that kind introduction. And I really appreciate being here. It's an honor, and I've always enjoyed my trips here. And actually being in this room, I can only think of Eric Olin Wright, with whom I had many sorts of exchanges in the 1980s in this room. He would always put me right. I see you've still got a blackboard here. And he would, after I would give some sort of talk, he would go up there and put it in a 2x2 table. Not always. Sometimes there were more sophisticated graphs. And then he would explain to me, as he explains to others, what I was really trying to say. Work has deteriorated ever since I left, particularly since he has passed. Anyways, it's great to be back here. The last time I was in this room, I was talking about Pierre Bourdieu. I think I had about 6. That was funny. I was having a conversation with Eric in my kitchen in Oakland. He used to come and visit me and give classes in Berkeley. And he knew of my increasing obsession with Pierre Bourdieu. And he did not share that obsession from it. But being there, he said, okay, why don't you come to the Haven Center, as it was then, and give some lectures on Pierre Bourdieu. It was the first set of lectures I gave on Pierre Bourdieu. And he would sit on the front and, again, explain to me then or afterwards what I should really be saying. I didn't always agree with him. But anyway, that was a very different set of lectures from the ones I want to give in the next 10 days. I was not a real fan of Bourdieu. I thought that Marxists should be taking him very seriously but critically. And that's what I did. And I really didn't enjoy those about 12 years or perhaps even longer, from about 2002 to 2000, probably 16. That's 14 years living with Pierre Bourdieu. None of you here probably have tried that. I don't recommend it. I used to read a paragraph of Pierre Bourdieu, and then I would have to take a nap, then read the next paragraph. I think anybody who's tried to read Bourdieu or his classic works have a similar view. Yes. Anyway, so I have a very different relationship to W.E.B. Du Bois. I think he's the greatest sociologist that has ever walked the earth. And I don't expect you necessarily to agree with me, but nevertheless, I'm here to try and convince you of the extraordinary scope, brilliance of his writings, but also of his political interventions. Well, some of you may know that actually W.B. Du Bois, 1868, he was born 1963. He died in Ghana in exile. But there is a revolution afoot. It is said in many places in the departments of sociology across the country that there is a revolution, a Du Boisian revolution afoot. And I'm skeptical of this idea of a Du Boisian revolution, but I think that we have to take Du Bois's work very seriously. We're relatively late in actually confronting and engaging Bourdieu in sociology. But I think it's not too late. And I think this moment in time, particularly, it is particularly important. Yes. So who was Du Bois? Let me say a few things about Du Bois. Simple. First, he was an academic. And as an academic, he was a historian and a sociologist. He came to sociology by virtue of being in Germany in between 1892 and 94. And I'll say much more about that today. As an intellectual, as a public intellectual, he was an editor of a very famous African-American magazine, The Crisis, from 1910 to 1933, 34. So that's 24 years. He was a journalist. He was a novelist. Read his novels. They're amazing. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And he was also a poet. As an activist, he was a Pan-Africanist, a leading Pan-Africanist. And his Pan-Africanism often had a Americocentric perspective, but he was recognized as somebody who promoted the interests of particularly in the countries of Africa. And he organized essentially 5 Pan-African congresses, or was a leading figure in the organization of them, the last being one in Manchester, which was probably the most important one, of 1945. Many of the participants were actually leaders to be in Africa, and he was made president of that Congress in Manchester in recognition of his contributions to Pan-Africanism. He was also a socialist for many years. I would say he started being a socialist in 1907 and never really gave it up. And he was famously also a major, if not one of the most major peace advocates, particularly in the United States after the Second World War, and got into a lot of trouble with the US state. I'll say something about that too. So yes, an academic, an intellectual, and an activist. Extraordinary. And the thesis I'm going to pursue today is that his activism really sort of shaped his intellectuality and his engagement with sociology. I don't know. Did anybody listen to the recordings? Anybody? Yes. Well, you may have noticed it suddenly stops at the end, if you got that. Well, there are 5 lines 5 lines missing from the talk. I'm not sure why those 5 lines are missing, why it was cut off, but I want to just, for those who didn't, just give you a flavor of his conclusion, which was the last 5 lines from that. So let's see if I can make this work. Doesn't work. I'm not hearing. Why is this? Let's check. All right, well, anyway, that's what I want. So I'll do. Okay, this is the last 5, well, it's more than 5 lines. I have to sort of start paragraph before. Anyway, let me read to you. I cannot read like the Bois. I mean, he's so distinctive in his voice. Gary said he comes from Boston, but he, of course, doesn't. He comes from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, nevertheless. Anyway, here we go. Remember how Browning, this is, the reason why I'm presenting this to you here today is because in 1960, he was invited by the Socialist Club of the University of Wisconsin at Madison to give an address to students in, is it still the Memorial Hall?
It's Memorial.
Memorial Union. And well, it was a great event. And if you listen to it, it's interesting. He said something, he never jokes around. He's not like me. He's straight, but he said some things that are rather funny. And it's interesting to listen to the audience. It takes them about 10 or 15 seconds to recognize that this was a joke. But anyway, this is not a joke, this ending of this talk that he gives. It's about 30 minutes long, this talk. He said, remember how Robert Browning once sang, "Oh, to be in England now that April's there." He's Browning, in Du Bois's interpretation, Browning is reflecting upon how wonderful it is to be in England in April. But why is it wonderful? Is because Britain has an empire, and it is the empire that makes it so wonderful to be in England in April. Today in Wisconsin, one hears the winds of spring. But listen, low and long, the wails we hear are not all spring. Their moans beneath the swish of whips, the songs of South Africa lashing civilization into Africans with drip of blood and roar of guns and sob of mothers and babies. So it's saying, yes, Wisconsin too benefits from the empire beyond. This is part of the system which many of you, he's talking to those students, many of you defend. Americans have $300 million invested in South Africa, 2.5 times as much as they had 10 years ago. This investment must make profit, even as England's April does. For our profits, the blacks must work for what we offer. Come unto me, all that ye that labor and are heavy laden, chant Jew and Christian, and I will give you hell. Take my yoke upon you, or I will bash your black faces in. Listen to the winds, listen to the wail of death and weep. Trying to convey, I think, to the students in the audience that their life is connected to worlds beyond. And it's those worlds beyond that make it possible for the affluence, make it possible for them to be students, for the University of Wisconsin to exist, for there to be affluence at all. Though, of course, he never denies that there is much poverty and oppression in the United States. Yes. So the photograph, can I go? I must be able to go back. Yes, that photograph, I deliberately chose this one. These are the gentlemen, all gentlemen, African Americans who set up the Niagara movement in 1905, which was the forerunner of the NAACP, National Association of Advancement of Colored People. And these gentlemen were the beginnings of a civil rights movement, which Du Bois would play a very important part in. So this was 1905, and NAACP was born in 1909. It was the beginning of, you might say, of his more open and overt political activism. Yes. I should say one thing. Du Bois uses the N-word a lot. Both N-words. I'm going to recognize the M-word when I talk about his books, titles of his writings, but I will try to avoid using the N-word in my own speech, and I'll and when I think it's appropriate, I will just replace the N-word with another word. For the most part, I will stick to the titles, and if anybody has problems with that, they should email me. Yes.
Physically, was the photo taken?
When?
Where physically?
It was it was the Niagara movement. This was the first meeting. It's near the Niagara Falls. Yeah. All right. Okay. Let me say something about these lectures. They're going to be four. The first is today on critical engagement, and I'm going to suggest that Du Bois can be seen as a critic of public sociology. Well, we'll see where I go with that. And on Thursday, I'm going to talk about an issue that has been the focus of many books, articles across the globe, the question of racial capitalism. And I think many of the articles and discussions of racial capitalism have used Du Bois's work as a sort of terrain of contestation. And I'm going to try and go to the works themselves from the beginning to the end to see what is the relationship Du Bois had in mind and how it changed the relationship between race, class, and capitalism. And having done that, and having engaged the question that Cedric Robinson raises, namely, are we to think of Du Bois as a Marxist, Black Marxist, or a contributor to the Black radical tradition? Having raised that question, I'm going to suggest that we then turn to look at sociology and to see what his contributions are to sociology and to the project of decolonizing sociology. And I have perhaps an unconventional view of what that might mean. And then finally, and we'll talk next week, that's what on Black Marxism, which is another way of thinking about Du Bois, namely his connection to people like C.L.R. James, people like Stuart Hall, Walter Rodney, Frantz Fanon. In fact, I will probably focus on Fanon and Du Bois. And they have some ways a similar trajectory, in other ways a fundamentally different one. One of the features of these talks is to look at Du Bois's work life as a whole. I think in the Du Boisian revolution, there is a tendency to cherry pick Du Bois. That part of Du Bois one likes the best. The Marxists may pick up on Black Reconstruction. Sociologists may pick up on folks of the early writings. And there is a tendency to devote oneself to those particular writings and essentialize Du Bois and reduce Du Bois to particular writings. I want to sort of try. My obsession is with the whole, which is another problematic thing to do because, and I will be periodizing Du Bois. Du Bois is difficult to talk about the whole because he keeps on wandering backwards and forwards. So it's a tricky project, but each one of the talks I will give will actually we try and see a thread through Du Bois's work and how he changes his mind and how he reinvents himself to his dying day. And in that way, I find him totally inspiring at my age to see the ways Du Bois, to his literally, even when he is in Ghana in exile, rethinking his past, rethinking a vision of the future. Yes. All right. Good. Now we can begin. Okay, yes, this is working. I want to begin with public sociology in a tribute to Eric. I'm sure to this room, I'm sure I had many discussions with Eric about this. This is what I presented in 2004 in the ASA presidential address. And I came up with these 4 types of sociology: professional, public, policy, critical, and public. I'm not going to go into great details. I'm not going to go into any details of this. But of course, 2x2 tables have their dimensions. So there's sociology that is oriented to the academics, and there is a sociology that's oriented beyond academy. And then on the more controversially, the more on the what knowledge for what, instrumental and reflexive knowledge. Instrumental knowledge is concerned with solving problems or puzzles, whereas the reflexive sociology is engaging in the moral foundations of sociology, and with whom academics or extra-academics. Anyway, what I want to say is what has happened. I'm stunned. One doesn't really expect anything that one writes or delivers to have any longevity at all. But I am amazed how this idea of public sociology continues to agitate people in sociology. And what has happened over time, it has actually spread to different countries, and where it looks, the picture of public sociology looks very different. But the debate, particularly the debate within this country, has been ferocious in many contexts. There are maybe many symposia. There are a few journals that have not had debates about this. And what has happened is there's been basically an attack on my vision of public sociology. People say you can't distinguish policy sociology from public sociology. People say you can't separate critical from public, and you definitely can't separate professional from public. The professional sociologists do public sociology. The policy sociologists, that is public sociology. And the critical sociologists, well, what we really should be doing is engaging in public critique. Anyway, so that's been one set of debates. Yeah. Another set of debates, another strategy, people place themselves, perhaps not self-consciously, but take the standpoint of one of these boxes, and they reduce the others to some sort of pathology. And they often reduce public sociology to pop sociology, no longer sociology. And the policy sociologists really dislike public sociology because it looks as though it's politicizing sociology and therefore undermining their credibility as scientists who are looking for clients to do their research for. So yes, I think there's been an interesting attempt to celebrate one's own sociology and pathologize everybody else's. And there have been also efforts to say, well, sociology actually is born in publics beyond the academy. And actually, there's a lead article in Sociological Theory by Elie Menczi, who makes precisely this point, that we should not be looking at sending sociology out, but importing sociology from the Zapatistas, for example. And so, yes, so there have been debates about the relationship between sociology and its publics. All right. Now, this whole project began in many ways when I visited South Africa after not being there for 22 years, after the end of the academic boycott. I went in 1990 and I discovered a whole different sociology that I was not accustomed to hanging out in Berkeley, which was all American sociology, so professionalized. There, sociologists were in the trenches of civil society, working with trade unions and doing what? Struggling to form and elaborate, he has written all about this, to elaborate a future, a vision, and to promote the struggle against apartheid. And in the process generated a new type of sociology, new theories, new forms of engagement. And so then I came back and I thought, well, this is very interesting type of sociology. And I actually wrote an article, South Africanizing US Sociology. Didn't go very far. And so then I got really interested. I thought that my department in Berkeley had a sort of element of public sociology, and I became chair, and I sort of elaborated that, and I became president of the ASA, and I promoted this idea of public sociology. And in South Africa, they too thought, oh, it comes from us, must be good. So they started talking about public sociology too. And of course, you go to well, we have Brazilian colleagues over here today. You go to Brazil talking about public sociology. Hey, God, the guy's crazy. What's that one? Sociology has to be public. I mean, what other sociology can there be? Well, in the United States, they have other ideas. So South Africans adopted the idea of public sociology, but then they started to say, no, there's something wrong. He's taken our idea, taken it to the United States, put the United States in a 2x2 table, universalized the whole project, and now takes it back to South Africa. That is known as imperialism, epistemological imperialism. And so they developed an interesting movement against public sociology, saying that public sociology was very much an American phenomenon, and it was very much about the debates in the United States. Yeah. And they saw that what they did, and my friend Eddie Webster, who I've known for many, many years, called critical engagement. And sad to say, I must recognize that he died only a few weeks ago. He was also a close friend of Eric's and people in this room who study South Africa. Anyway, he had developed this idea of critical engagement, in a sense, starting from reflecting upon the sociology of engagement during the apartheid era, starting from the problems in society, building a sociology from there, rather than being concerned with debates within sociology. There's been a sort of what I call an introversion, disciplinary introversion in the United States in this debate about public sociology, concerned with where the discipline is going, but these were issues that did not worry the South African. And they were very much more devoted to an engagement, a critical engagement, because the critical moment reflected that they were not necessary, though they began as supporters of the anti-apartheid movement, nevertheless were able to take some distance from that engagement. And that is the significance of the word critical. Yeah. All right. And what I want to suggest to you today, I know it's a long introduction. What I want to suggest to you today is that Du Bois represents critical engagement rather than public sociology. Du Bois was not concerned with the fate of sociology as such. He was concerned with the fate of the world. And I would suggest it is this critical engagement that we desperately need today. That is why we should take Du Bois's work and life so very seriously. All right. Yes, I've said all this. That's good. Okay, so I'm going to periodize. It's a very risky thing to do, but I'm going to do it. Periodize Du Bois's life as follows. Scholar Denied, which is the title of Alden Morris's book that actually you might say was the catalyst of any Du Boisian revolution in sociology that occurred. A magnificent book, incredibly important, beautifully written, an argument that W.E.B. Du Bois was the founder of US sociology. But he elaborated the Atlanta School. He was at the Atlanta University, 1897 to 1910. And this predated the Chicago School by 20 years. And much of the book is about how problematic was Robert Parks' ideas, the leader of Chicago School, and how Du Bois really was way ahead, not just before, but also way ahead of the Chicago School. I mean, yeah, as you'll see next week, yes, who reads Robert Parks? Anybody? Yes, very distinguished professor. Yes, she's also, not a young professor. What about?
Yeah, what does that mean?
That's right. So, yes. Anyway, I don't know. I think that compared to boys with Robert Park is, with all due respect to Robert Park, is not a sort of fight of great gladiators. But in fact, you should compare Robert Park with other Chicago sociologists, and Du Bois should be actually engaged, and I will talk about that next week with Max Weber and Durkheim. Then we get some more interesting discussions, in my view. But anyway, Scholar Denied is in fact a story of the ways in which Du Bois had to face a very oppressive environment, and being African-American found it incredibly difficult to actualize his research program. And so that is the period 1895 to 1910, in which he is an academic and trying to become an established academic. And he later on writes, he says that, if it were not for my race, I probably would, in fact, have become a relatively conformist sociologist. But my race forced me to think other ways and actually led me to exit, I'll say today, exit the university, becomes a founder member of the NAACP and the editor of the Crisis magazine. And this is the period of Scholar Unbound, and in which he explores all sorts of important issues going on in the world, racial, class, capitalist, colonial, imperial character, which I'll say a little bit today. Then, he clashes with the NAACP, and it's relatively, from his point of view, reformist politics. He sees the reformist politics, particularly the strategies of legal interventions, as not being very effective. He sees the New Deal and the radicalism that goes along with that around him. And he is, in a sense, forced out of the editorship of the Crisis. And he actually then goes back to Atlanta University, and there he writes magnum opus, Black Reconstruction, a very thick book, 700 pages, which written in 1935, and it took historians another 30 years to catch up with him. It was as I will be saying, a number of the lectures, a dramatically transformative understanding, the origins of the Civil War, the process of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and afterwards. So what happens, Atlanta University, he was a very difficult guy. it was really difficult. I wouldn't want to have to interview him or meet him even. He had a, yes, you might say, had a chip on his shoulder. He was clearly a genius, but not recognized by so many as such. And he found his life very challenging and intolerable that he was subjected to the racism that he was subjected to. So yeah, yeah. You knew when W.E.B. Du Bois was in the room. Yes. Anyway, that is the period. He goes to Atlanta University and they can't deal with him. And on the grounds of his age, in 1944, he was what? 44 plus 32 makes 76 years old. And he was pushed out of Atlanta University, and NAACP took him back. But it was only 4 years later that he was pushed out of the NAACP. And then he began to write some very important works around imperialism, world and Africa, color and democracy. And so this period was indeed his Marxist period. And I'll explain why he became a Marxist, or I will try to. And then the last period of his life, when he became a peace activist, an enemy of the US state, he was scholar persecuted. And he lost many of his, particularly his African-American friends, and spent a lot of time with his second wife, Shirley Graham, in her community, communists in New York, and finally found his position to be very precarious in this country, and accepted Kwame Nkrumah's invitation to Ghana. He did that in 1961, but not before joining the US Communist Party, and which he had always refused to do, thumbing his nose at the US state for the way that they had in fact persecuted him. And he joined in 61, went to Ghana and died in 63. Okay, now I love to have pictures, but my pictures in PowerPoints. What I'm going to do now is tell you the story yet again, only in more depth. 15 minutes. Okay. So, this is his education. Comes from Great Barrington in western Massachusetts, and in a largely white community. He is a star pupil. He doesn't really experience deep racism until the alcohol age, as he says in The Souls of Black Folks. One of schoolmates wouldn't reciprocate his visiting card, and he realized he was different from the others. But basically, there was not a deep racism there, and the local community in Great Barrington sponsored his university career, starting Fisk University. Very interesting story about how that community now has refused for a long time to recognize W.E.B. Du Bois because one of theirs joined the Communist Party. So there's extraordinary fights in that area of Massachusetts around his legacy. Anyway, so Great Barrington, 8 years. So then he goes to Fisk University, where he discovers his blackness, he's with Black students, and there he develops a whole new understanding of who he is. Also begins to be a journalist there. But he was always thought that he belonged at Harvard University. And so when he got his degree in Fisk, he went to Harvard University, who of course required that he did another 2 years and then to get the Harvard degree. And he got his Harvard degree and then signed up for a PhD. And he was the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard. And he wrote it in this field of history, a very interesting book I actually won't talk a lot about, but called The Suppression of the Slave Trade in the United States. Many of the ideas of his subsequent work found also traces of them can be found in that dissertation that was published as a book. He goes off to the University of Berlin, 1892 to 94, and there discovers sociology. And also, still at this time had a vision. As he says, as he admits in his last autobiography published posthumously, he still thought, still was uncritical about colonialism. And he was very much enamored by Germany and the way that they treated him. They did not treat him as he had been treated in the United States. He was not recognized as a peculiar racial figure. What was important in Germany was his status as measured by the way he dressed and the way he looked. And if you look at some of the photographs of Du Bois, you always wonder, why is this guy so all dressed up with a goatee and a hat and white gloves and a walking stick? Yes, he established himself, and he always, he never to this dying day could really get rid of his love for Germany, because it really did reshape his life, even though he was there for 2 years. He didn't get a PhD for all sorts of interesting reasons, but maybe officially he wasn't there long enough and his scholarship wouldn't allow him to stay there longer. He then came back. He could not get, even though he was appropriately qualified to get the best jobs in the university system, but in the United States, but being African-American, he had to go to a historically Black university. He went to Wilberforce University in Ohio. He couldn't stand it. They forced him, they wouldn't let him teach sociology, and he had to teach classics. Anyway, he got out of there and became a lowly research assistant at the University of Pennsylvania, not recognized as such, but he was given the task of writing what became the Philadelphia Negro, a study of the 7th Ward in Philadelphia, study of the African Americans. It was the most populated African American ward, and it was a magical book. I'll talk about it then. And so that's where I will begin. Other picture, scholar denied. So after the University of Pennsylvania, he goes to Atlanta University, another Black university, and there he finishes off the Philadelphia Negro. It is a book that he devotes, I think Herbert Apteker, his literary executor, figures that he interviewed 2,500 families in a period of 4 months, 1,000 hours devoted. He was a single researcher studying what became known as the first community study. He was actually assisted by Isabel Eaton, whose name is often forgotten, but he definitely did an enormous amount of work as a single researcher. He was committed to sociology as a science that would help the world understand the plight of African Americans, as not being intrinsic to African Americans, being a product of two sets of forces. On the one hand, the migration from the South in the post-slavery, post-emancipation period, post-bellum period, on the one side, and on the other side, forces of discrimination. And he was able to talk about the social life, family life, occupational life of the African Americans in the 7th Ward. And he appealed to them to actually follow the American ideology, the work ethic. He was trying to actually convince Blacks that they should actually not engage in what he would refer to as pathological activities. He had a stratification system that what we would now call in this room SES, socioeconomic status. And he had 4 classes. The top one, those really the talented 10, those who are well educated, those had somewhat professional jobs. Then there was the working class, the stable and the unstable working class, and finally the submerged tenth. And he was very critical of the submerged tenth for the lax morals, as he probably would say, that they exhibited in the Seventh Ward. So he was appealing to African Americans on the one side, but also appealing to whites. Now, look, he's saying to the whites, whose audience the book was supposed to address, African Americans are like others. They respond to the social situation in which they find themselves. And so he also was making every effort to bend over backwards. And he was particularly concerned. He was saying, why do whites always view African Americans by the depressed classes and not by the elites? Why don't you recognize me? And of course, that was his attempt, as I say, to persuade whites that through this sociological analysis, he was already a public sociologist trying to persuade whites that they should take blacks seriously. And the Souls of Black Folk was out. Have people read the Souls of Black Folk? You have to read these things, I'm afraid. It's poetry, wonderful poetry. I tried to work with Souls of Black Folk in the 90s. It didn't sort of trigger with me as a serious, but it is a magnificent book. It's written in a completely different register, not a scientific register, but his experiences mainly in rural Tennessee and in Georgia and in Alabama. His sort of ethnographic, almost vignettes, 10 or 15 pages, an essay, beautifully written. Again, trying to demonstrate that actually blacks are human beings too. And that didn't work. Couldn't persuade whites. He couldn't really do what he wanted to do at Atlanta University, which was develop a serious research program to build the Atlanta School, to get funds. Booker T. Washington had a hold on funds by virtue of Booker T's relationship to corporate capital, corporate donors in the North. And so he found huge obstacles by virtue of his race to actually develop his research program. And he began to be skeptical of whether science will actually convince people of truth. Yeah. And at the same time, as a result, in part because of his experiences in Germany, and his particularly, when he went to meetings of the Social Democratic Party, he became interested in socialism as early as 1907. And all along, beginning in 1905, the Niagara movement appealed to his view that somehow being in the university is not going to change the world, and that African Americans have to sort of engage beyond the university. And that was his entry first into the Niagara movements, and then Niagara movement, and then NAACP. All right, so this is the next period. Now he's scholar unbound. He's editor of Crisis Magazine. He has to deal with and has to engage the issues of the day. He's a member of the NAACP. Crisis is the magazine of NAACP. You can get it all online. They form out about every 2 months. Became the most popular African American magazine. He's writing The Negro in 1915, which is his first major exploration of what? Of the actual history of Africa, trying to show to African Americans that they really do have a history and that it is to be taken seriously and actually has contributed to their very distinctive culture. And Darkwater is my favorite book, and I probably say this every time I talk to you. You have to read this book. If anything you take away, it is this book. It's very thin and full of wonderful essays, some of them very famous essays. One of the essays is Souls of White Folk. The Souls of White Folk. Yeah. Another one, we'll come back to that in a second. Another one is Of Work and Wealth, which is about the race riot at East St. Louis white capital, white labor, black labor. He is becoming ever more invested in trying to understand the split labor market, racially split. And then there are other essays like The Damnation of Women and a beautiful little story at the end about the comet, fiction. It's New York. The white woman and black guy left, and how the relationship develops. And suddenly the whites come back, and then we think, all right, it's a very sad, tragic, but interesting story. Anyway, the point is, yes, the souls of white folk. So in the souls of black folk, what's he doing? He's trying to persuade whites that blacks are human. In the souls of white folk, he's trying to persuade what? He's trying to persuade blacks that whites are inhuman. It is, of course, the foundation study of whiteness studies. It is a study of imperialism and the history of imperialism. It is, yes, a classic. But he has now become much more critical. And in that essay, in both essays that I just mentioned, there is already an imaginary, as Eric would say, probably an imaginary utopia of socialism at the end. But he says, we'll never get to socialism so long as those unions, as long as socialist parties don't give priority to what? To the race question. No, you can't wait until socialism. You better attend to this question now. Very critical of the Socialist Party. Okay. Look, it was a sign that I should. Okay. So that's that period of unbound. But now begins his critical period when he becomes Marxist. So the world is changing. He himself is still editor, but the revolution in Russia takes place. He takes an agnostic position on the revolution. There is the Harlem Renaissance. He accepts an invitation to go to the Soviet Union in 1926. He spends 3 months there. He comes back and he says, if what I have seen is Bolshevism, what I have heard is Bolshevism, then I am a Bolshevik. So what has he seen? He has seen a country that is attempting, through his eyes, attempting to eliminate poverty, a country that does not exhibit overt racism, and a country that seems to be supportive of anti-colonial struggles. And this is such a contrast with his experience in the United States. And when we hear and when we read that Du Bois was very much enamored by the Soviet Union and later China, but let's focus on the Soviet Union. He goes there in 1936 and 49 and 58, and he's always very pro-Soviet. You have to understand what he is comparing the Soviet Union with. You have to understand how he is horrified, continues to be horrified by the racism that is all around him and shapes his very existence in the United States. He is, for example, during the period he's editor of Crisis, he's writing a lot and does research into lynching. Yes, there are the purges in the Soviet Union, but there's lynching in the United States. So yeah, you have to imagine. And it's true of Langston Hughes, it's true of Paul Robeson. They all were captivated by the project of the Soviet Union. All right, then he begins to get interested in Marx. Now, the guy has not been reading Marx. It's unbelievable. And he starts blaming his teachers for not teaching him Marx, and who he puts on a level of Kant and Hegel and the Bible. All right. Yeah, he gets very upset with his teachers. And so he gathers around him younger African Americans who begin to teach him about Marx. And he's an autodidact. I mean, he absorbs the ideas of Marx and Marxism so quickly. Yeah, I know it's already 3. I'll be done. I'm really getting that. So given the discourse in the New Deal and the radical projects of the New Deal, he himself becomes ever more radical alienates the NAACP and develops a strategy akin to the ideas of the Communist Party, though the link between the two is not totally clear, the Black Belt thesis. Du Bois writes in 1933 an article called The Negro Nation Within a Nation. The idea being that, look, segregation is not going to go away. So let's work with it. Let's constitute economy for African Americans by African Americans, what he called the cooperative commonwealth. And he develops these ideas, and they look actually, and he's accused of being sort of a fellow traveler with, guess who? Booker T. Washington, who has been his nemesis, enemy, particularly in The Souls of Black Folk, written in 1903. And everybody saw that Booker T. Washington had this reformist, compromise character, give up on political rights, give up on higher education, all of which, by the way, is not true, because research shows that actually Booker T. Washington was speaking one story, but doing another story. And the other story that Booker T. Washington was doing at Tuskegee, building education, and not just vocational education, but that actually Booker T. Washington was not the evil person that Du Bois painted him in 1903, and Du Bois has ever recognized that later on in his life. Yes, but anyway, the point is the idea is that that African Americans should try to organize their own economy. And during this period, also the anti-colonial period, beginnings of anti-colonialism, his participation in Pan-African conferences also led him to develop a whole new vision, which is, here we are. So back at Atlanta University, he writes Black Reconstruction. Now, I cannot go into what that is, but just let me tell you what the chapter titles are. First chapter, Black Worker. Second chapter, White Worker. Third chapter, Planter. Fourth chapter, General Strike. General Strike, yes, General Strike. What was the General Strike? Anybody know what the General Strike was? You need to read Black. Yes.
Slaves leaving the plantations.
Yeah, right. The defection of slaves, without which, Du Bois argues, the North would never have won the war. So he brings agency, he brings a global perspective, he brings a class analysis, and then towards the end of the book, having written about the balance of class and race forces within different states, he then talks about the counter-revolution of property. And then the last chapter, next last but one, is back towards slavery, post-Reconstruction. All right, that's a long story, but I want to convince you that this is a Marxist story. Yeah. Anyway, we could Dusk of Dawn is another reflection it's also another autobiographical book in which he sort of reflects and discovers and here he says, I should have not read Marx. I should have read Right. Because you can't understand racism, Du Bois argues, not just through looking at material factors. There's something fundamentally irrational about racism. We need to go beyond sort of material explanations. So he's recognizing the depth of racism in the United States in Dusk of Dawn, amongst many of them. Another beautiful book. Yes. Right. And then, of course, he's brought back into the NAACP, and they don't realize what they brought back. They thought he was there just to sit around and give some sort of kudos to the NAACP, but he does not stop. He becomes very politically active and writes Color and Democracy, which is about the anti-colonial movement and the role or the absent role of the United Nations, and then the world in Africa, which is a study of the imperialism, the history of imperialism and how it affected Africa. Some beautiful passages on commodity fetishism, stories about how aristocratic white women are playing with their piano ivory keys, and then he goes back and talks about what produced the ivory keys. Extraordinary. Anyway, I can't talk about it. This is scholar radicalized, and finally, he gets involved in the peace movement. He becomes ever more critical of the United States. He had a sort of monopoly capitalist view, and of course, he's on the wrong side of the Cold War. He is enamored by Soviet Union, and in the peace movement, he's seen to be a propagator of the interests of the Soviet Union. He's indicted for being an undeclared foreign agent, presumably over the Soviet Union. He's on trial in 1951. He is acquitted. His statement was fabricated witness. But then his passport is taken away. He can't travel. He becomes very much associating with communists in New York and becoming radical African-American women. So he's developing a critique of the US, being later, and now he's also mixing that in with his understanding of imperialism and the Cold War. And he's in the NAACP till 48. They move him out. He writes this amazing book that Apteker told him not to publish. Everybody else told him not to publish, called Russia and America, in which he basically celebrates Soviet Union and its wonderful democracy. On the other hand, it's rather critical, sort of monopoly capitalist, imperialist United States. And yes. So yes, it's very interesting that he actually is totally critical of Leon Trotsky, who seemed to be dangerous, but seconding the vision of the yes. And Battle for Peace is his account, and his account of the trial in which he finally is acquitted. Yes, and when he writes, of course, he puts everything in its historical context, as well as giving you the day-to-day blows. It's very good at the extended case method. And then exile, he joined the Communist Party in 1961 and leaves for Ghana. He's finding his situation untenable, not before traveling around the world for about a year in 1958, when the Supreme Court overturns the denial of his passport. He travels to China and Russia and spends a lot of time there. Of course, there he is in China. There he is in China talking about the wonders of China. This is the great leap forward. I mean, this is the Stalinist period in Chinese history. And there is Du Bois talking about the wonders of China and how Africa should follow the Chinese path. Anyway, that's another story for a future class. So that's it. That's the story. Okay, very good. Now let me finish. I believe that story, particularly the black parts, are an extraverted sociology rather than introverted sociology. That public sociology is really an obsession of sociologists with what the hell we should be doing. Whereas Du Bois is really concerned with the political issues of his time. I hope I have illustrated that. So that's the main point, that I think what he offers us is a critique of public sociology. It is a story of critical engagement in dark times. And I was just recently in Florida and defending sociology. DeSantis is really performing all sorts of extraordinary assaults on education generally, higher education in particular, as we probably all know. The ways he is changing the boards of trustees, the way he is placing his own people there, the actual legislative acts that are attacking the curriculum, banning books, critical race theory, DEI, and so on and so forth. It's a long story that I can't talk about at this point. But I think the question is, how as sociologists shall we deal with this? Some people want to retreat and say, oh, we're scientists. How can you accuse us of being political? That was the scientist's view, right? But the sociology is full of leftists. I say, yours is full of leftists. But the ASA wants to sort of say, no, we're scientists, not leftists. But I think that we must be doing something right if DeSantis is after us. We should be the vanguard of a vision, an alternative vision. That's all right. Brazilians probably know more about strategies in this context than me. But anyway, yes. So I think I've always thought of sociology as a standpoint of civil society against political authoritarianism, against market despotism. Right. So, yeah, I think when we face political authoritarianism, we can't stand still. That's what Du Bois' story is all about, not standing still, refusing to accept it, refusing to lie down. Du Bois' sociology, what is it? My last, gosh, I really have gone over. Last, experiential sociology. He believes he's in the world he's studying. He's in the world he's studying. And doesn't just put his toe in. He's a lifelong engagement with the world he is studying. And he's a reflexive sociologist in the sense that he is continually rethinking his past and his previous engagements and recognizing the mistakes he makes. He makes mistakes because he is continually confronting political issues. And he is developing a global and historical sociology, a flawed global and historical sociology. And I believe Du Boisians should examine the flaws in his writings. But it is a global and historical sociology, in some ways original for his time, and one that involves moral foundations and utopian visions. He often uses literature, fiction, to actually create visions of potential utopias. He had imaginary utopias in Darkwater in 1920, but by the time he's writing Black Reconstruction in 1935, he's got a real utopia that is emerging in the period of Reconstruction and interracial democracy. So yes, yeah. And of course, race is running through each of these 4 dimensions of his sociology. And that is my last comment. Du Bois faces despair, but he never gives up hope. And he's always looking for alternative ways out of the present and the problematic aspects of the present. And that's one of the most extraordinary ways in which he resonates with what I think sociologists should be doing and what, indeed, Havens Right Center has been doing, continues to be doing, and what Eric, of course, was well known for. He too was like Du Bois, would never let go of his optimism, even in the face of despair. That is Du Bois, and I'm hoping that I've convinced you he's worth taking seriously. Thank you very much.
What you're mentioning that he read Freud, really interesting. And you also mentioned that fundamental irrationality about racism. Since you were at the university where George Bois was also, could you talk about how you have seen Bois?
Bois was here. No?
He was here.
Yeah, I wasn't here. Yeah.
But how he would he have said, but Mr. Bois, what about blood?
I don't know. I don't know Bois well enough. Do you have thoughts about this?
In terms of both of them and Freud, with the irrationality of the right racism coming from a non-material standpoint.
Yes. Well, I think when he is Du Bois is most explicit about that is in Dusk of Dawn, which is about his 3rd autobiography. And what he says is that he hasn't read Freud. He complains that now he knows he should have read Freud, but he never really does read Freud. In fact, he writes a 3-volume fictional account of his own life reconstructed in the 1950s when he can't travel. And there, one of the figures actually is somebody who is very practiced in psychoanalysis. It's a fictional story, but it represents an aspiration that he never really comes through on. Yes, I mean, one of the most graphic moments in The Dusk of Dawn, he takes Plato's Cain allegory and he puts African Americans in this enclosed cave. And he describes how they're beating on the window out into the world, and how others, whites, are passing by, seeing how crazy they are. It's a story, essentially, the desperation of African Americans feeling caged, engaging in irrational activities because they cannot get out of the cage. And then the way whites see them as these irrational, quote, animals. It's a very powerful imagery of use. And I should say that you may have figured this out, much of what I have been talking about, and much of Du Bois's account of colonialism and of internal colonialism, if you wish, in this country, is captured in dare I say it, the Israeli-Palestine relationships. There are many, many close parallels, particularly, for example, if you read The Souls of White Folk, you would see a particular vision what's been happening in the relationship between Israel and Palestine. Yeah, but I'm not really answering your question about George Martin, since it's about 50 years since I said. Yes.
So you talked a bit about how Du Bois's thought in sociology is formed in large part in reaction to his exclusion from structures of power and his exclusion from intellectual life as a Black person. I'm curious as to what you think Du Bois might have to offer for sociologists in the present who might be sympathetic to or who do have access to those structures of power in the present day.
Du Bois's view, which I've not mentioned, but I should have done, so thanks very much for that question. He believed early on in the talented tenth, and for that meant the educated, professional, talented tenth, the African-American population, and argued that they had a responsibility to actually fight for the interests of all African Americans. And he hung on to that for quite some time. I think by the 1950s, he was becoming skeptical of this talented tenth, because what he was seeing was the formation of an African American bourgeoisie whose interests were not necessarily in the promotion of the African American population as a whole. And he was very disappointed when he was, in a sense, deserted by many of his fellow African Americans when he was on trial. Now, of course, they themselves were very skeptical about his movement leftwards and his socialist politics, his struggle as a peace activist. But still, from his point of view, he was always worried about in his later life, the formation of class within the African American population, an analysis that he didn't really develop when it came to the study of post-colonial Africa or post-colonial India, but nevertheless was of concern to him in the United States. So he would want to think of ways in which people in the universities had a broader responsibility. He saw the university as a place where that responsibility could be cultivated. And so he fought always for the university to be a broad tent that was actually represent progress. We spent you visited African American universities, Black universities, quite frequently with that sort of message. Yes, so that's the interesting question, isn't it? What would Du Bois be thinking now? Would he think about racial order today? I think if we read Black Reconstruction carefully and see his analysis of class and race and capitalism, that's where I would go. Yeah. Well, that's probably for the next lecture. Yeah. Somebody had a hand up down here.
It was like sort of a similar question because I was just wanting to see like if Du Bois ever reflected on how his ideas like perpetuate classism in the Black community, and also if any of his ideas contain like internalized racism, like due just like his need for being adjacent in white society. Like he was at Fisk, which is still very like profound, like HBCU now or whatever, but he still wanted Harvard. He still like was trying to appeal to white society instead of like empowering Black society through Black society itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think his elitism was very strong in the beginning. I think that was the whole idea of the talented 10th. The idea that they would be responsible to the African American population as a whole. But I think that elitism diminished. Let's put it that way. Diminished as he became involved in seeing, for example, I gave you the chapter from Black Reconstruction, the general strike. The whole project of Black Reconstruction was to show the agency of African Americans. And he was there talking about whom? He's talking about the enslaved and those who fled the plantations. So he became ever more embedded in the thoughts and experiences of dominated classes of African Americans. And when you read even The Souls of Black Folk, when he goes into the rural areas as a teacher of Tennessee and describes post-Reconstruction Tennessee, his project is to illuminate the actual lived experience of sharecroppers, of those who were fighting for education, literacy. So I think that the more he engaged in politics, the weaker became, in my view, his elitism. Well, that probably could be debated, whether to what extent it actually left him. Anyway, well, I'll talk about that probably. We can talk about it on Thursday. Yeah. Yes.
I've got a question about Du Bois and the specificity of the frameworks and theories he develops to the US context, and also how that changes over time. That is to say, okay, so how much are the theories of racialization, racism, theories of the specificities of those processes in the United States? Because you say at the end, he's developing a global sociology. So to what extent is it something that he's working towards, and is it through his engagement with Marxism, with international issues, that potentially drives him towards a greater global sociology, if in fact that's...
Oh, sure. That's a typical question. Thank you very much. Yes. Yes. Well, I think his ideas, and as will become clear on Thursday, in the beginning, he's got a stratification system that is sort of basically a status system within the African American population. And it's only, there are mentions, there are sort of intimations of capitalism in Souls of Black Folk. But when you get to Darkwater in 1920, then you have a full-blooded capitalism already. Not theorized, but it's there. White capital, white labor, black labor, split labor market. And he has in the Souls of White Folk, he has got a sort of an understanding of two-stage imperialism. So that is, I think, relatively new for him. Yeah, the first stage of imperialism is associated with slavery. The second stage is when slaves are emancipated out and slavery is outlawed, and then capital is not, the slaves are moving to the United States, but now capital is moving to Africa. So he's developing that. But the most sophisticated is where what he develops in Black Reconstruction, where you really do have the interests of capital, labor, white labor, black labor, but differentiated for North and South. They're very different, like different countries for him. Yes. Now, as for his global sociology, I think it's actually quite problematic. What you find, for example, we've got Brazilians here. I don't know if they know this, but Du Bois was an enthusiast for racial democracy in Brazil. This was in the 1910s, and he had a relationship with many of the elite in Brazil, and Gilberto Freire was somebody quite close to a theorist of racial democracy. And he saw that miscegenation in Brazil was bringing something wonderful, racial democracy. We have segregation here, but and that was, of course, that fitted in very nicely to the ideology of the ruling class in Brazil at the time, for whom miscegenation was actually a solution that they could propose to the world. And of course, in this country, miscegenation sort of implied some form of degeneration. So Du Bois was and then African Americans, it was not only Du Bois, African Americans went to Brazil and they discovered something called racism. And so Du Bois, for reasons that we could speculate, did not talk about Afro-Brazilians and their struggles in the same time. So he overlooked everything he wanted. He was looking for solutions on the one hand. And on the other hand, he was always looking for the enemy of the United States. The enemy of the US must be doing something good. Whether it's Japanese imperialism, China, Soviet Union, they must be doing something good. So what that misses is the internal class differentiation within, or racial differentiation within countries outside the United States. And very much taking the standpoint of the elite. But it's a very America-centric perspective. Thinking about what will make progress in the United States. So many of, and this will come up when I talk about Black Marxism. So when you think of Fanon, you think of actually there are struggles in the anti-colonial movement and in the post-colonial order, the likes of which Du Bois has nothing to say about. He only said China and Soviet capital, that's where you should go, not to the US and Britain. So I think he's got quite a problematic global sociology. And so what one has to do, it seems to me, is to, if one wants to be Du Boisian about this, to bring the theory of Black Reconstruction to global context. There's another interesting story is about he deals with India. He is infatuated by Gandhi. And he thinks that 1947 independence, wherever it was, August 15th, was one of the momentous period, one of the most greatest momentous periods in the last 2 or 3 centuries of global history. In India, people think he's like Ambedkar, who was at the same time arguing against caste. Gandhi was not too enthusiastic about Ambedkar's ideas. Gandhi was sort of soft on caste. Ambedkar was, and that must have gotten into trouble, Ambedkar was one who was really fighting for the Dalits. And so naturally, in India, commentators think that Ambedkar equals W.E.B. Du Bois. But actually, W.E.B. Du Bois was infatuated. He had they make a big thing. He had one letter exchange with Ambedkar which said nothing, but he was infatuated clearly with Gandhi because Gandhi represented an anti-imperial struggle. Yeah, so I think we have to take Black Reconstruction and then think about how that would apply to and lead in would lead him to reconstruct his global sociology. That's a big task, quite beyond me. But anyway, that's the way.
You have Nabila's question.
Okay.
Wait, thank you, Nabila, for writing it. She wants to say, hi, Michael, just to continue our conversation we started at last ASA, maybe that jogs your memory. How is professionalization of disciplines and the university linked to critical engagement? How can we get out of the professionalization trap in order to critically engage by learning from Du Bois?
Well, it's very tricky to get out of institutions that we're embedded in and seem to be all around us. I think that's why really I'm smart. This is the sort of the point of this first lecture, is to say that Du Bois's focus first on the political issues that are important, and then focus on sociology secondary, is a way to go. Now, it's easy for me to say, tired old Burawoy to say that. Now, how does one speak to graduate students? Nabila, I believe, is still a graduate student, though she may correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, yes, how does one fight? I always remember when I was at Berkeley that graduate students didn't tell me about their political projects, but they engaged in their political projects. And those political projects did actually inspire them to do the work that Du Bois would be proud of. Yeah, you may even have one or two in the audience today. You never know. But I don't know what secret political projects they had. When I hear them, that's
Lying. Clearly told him.
well, some people told me, some people didn't. I think those political projects actually inspire graduate students to do good work because it becomes meaningful. Whereas, excuse me, I know I'm in Wisconsin, but publishing in American Sociological Review requires a certain sort of narrow focus, and you produce something and you're very proud and you're very pleased, and it actually promotes the discipline in many ways. Many of the best ideas will come from graduate students, but still, 3 people will read it, 2 people will cite it. There's something very attractive about engaging in the world beyond. And also, that all of this response is that teaching is a very important political act. It doesn't have to be politicized, but the act of teaching and listening to and engaging with the lived experience of the students that come to the university strikes me as a very important project of public sociology, but also can actually bring one outside the confinement of the university. The tragedy is that graduate students in particular are becoming fewer and fewer, and those that continue are teaching, I don't know if it's true here, but it's true in most places it is, I'm teaching less and less. And that's one of the great things about the American university is the way that teaching and research come together. But this I see now as a separation. The American university is increasingly run by an aristocrat of tenured faculty who teach less and have more administrative work to do. And the teaching is done by lecturers, adjuncts, contingent workers. Their work is very important, but they don't have the resources and time and security to do the job that they have been often assigned. So I'm always amazed how devoted they can be. But anyway, I think, so those are my 2 answers, Nabila. I don't know if I ever told you that before, but and I think Du Bois has, you should look at the beginning of, Du Bois took his teaching, I think, as a sort of political act. I remember him reflecting at the beginning of the chapter of Work and Wealth, which is about the race rider E. St. Louis, and he's scratching his head. He's talking about teaching. Basically, when you teach, you have to deal with social problems. In this case, it was the race rider East St. Louis. And he says to himself, the students are asking me, African-American students, Atlanta University, should I trust whites? He says to himself, well, I know you can't trust whites. I can't tell the students that. So you can feel in the way he talks about teaching, the conflicts and the moral responsibilities and the political significance of teaching. And I think we could do more to reflect on that aspect of teaching.